Hi, I'm Elaine Englehardt from Utah Valley University, and welcome to our series, Discussions on Democracy. Today, we have David Knowlton, a professor of anthropology at Utah Valley University with us, and one of his students, Jordon Haug. Welcome to both of you. David was selected as the Center for the Study of Ethics Senior Fellow this year, and we'd like to ask him about some of the scholarship that he's done in the past and also scholarship that he's doing this year while he's on sabbatical. So welcome, David, and would you tell us about yourself?
Well, thank you, Elaine. It's lovely to be here. It's a wonderful program. It's fun to participate. I'm a social cultural anthropologist, and I focus on Latin America, particularly the people of Bolivia, people who speak a language known as Aymara, a very hard language, by the way. And I also have studied extensively Mormonism in Latin America. And as a result of that, I'm very interested in the development of global society and kind of the issues, social, ethical, cultural issues of this new convoluted world that we're moving into. I've published quite a few articles, mostly on Mormonism. And I think I'm more known for that than almost anything else, although increasingly I'm returning to my work in Bolivia and redeveloping that.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm. And Jordon, tell us about yourself.
Well, I'm a senior in here at UVU in anthropology. I'm applying to grad school right now and hope to continue a career in anthropology.
Okay, great. And you know, Jordon, when I went to Dr. Knowlton's webpage and looked at kind of the definition of who he is, it was very interesting. And I thought, aren't his senior students really lucky to have someone who will be getting them into grad school and giving them such fine advice? Is that how it's been for you?
Oh yeah, David's done a great job of helping us understand anthropological theory, the broader social theory that we'll encounter in grad school. That he's also he's been very rigorous in his teaching, but he's also been able to be there whenever a student needs them to help them in their interests, and it's been extremely helpful.
Oh, great. Well, let's look at some of your interests then, David. So you're a sociocultural anthropologist, and you specialize in the anthropology of Latin America and with a focus on the Andes. So what is a sociocultural anthropologist?
Well, someone who's not on the unemployment lines.
Well, that's a good thing, isn't it?
These days, social. No, and I joke because, of course, that's the first thing parents ask their kids when they study anthropology is, what are you going to do? And a social cultural anthropologist, in this case, it's kind of a hybrid term. I put it because the dominant part of the field of anthropology right now looks at culture. And I enjoy that issue of culture, but I'm also very intrigued by society. And we could get into the definitions of these if you want, although it does get rather complex quickly. Yeah. But I'm very interested in social arrangements and social organizations, social institutions. So perhaps a simple way of saying it is that I'm a little bit of a sociologist. But I don't think they would accept me, so I do too much cultural anthropology.
Okay.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Oh, very much. Anything you'd like to ask David about that or comment on, Jordon?
Well, one of the things that I've noticed about David's work is that he does go in between the two realms of cultural anthropology and social anthropology, which in Britain focuses much more on the social structure forces that encounter. It's very similar to sociology here in the United States.
Well, there are historical reasons for that. I got my degree at the University of Texas, which ironically the program was founded in part by a relationship with the University of Chicago and Bronislaw Malinowski. I don't know if Jordon even knows this, who's one of the founders of British social anthropology.
Okay.
And so part of what distinguished us was this oddly enough continental encounter. And then when I was there, it continued into continental philosophy, continental social theory. And so that kind of gave us a brand, while American anthropology was more cultural and moved far more solidly into ideas and meanings and symbols and so on.
You know, that explains a lot to me about your different scholarship that I've read and listened to over the years.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Now, this is kind of an elephant in the room, the Anthropology of Mormonism and Social Theory.
Oh,
So
boy.
this is at a state school in a predominantly Mormon community. So how does this go over to study the anthropology of Mormonism and our social theory of Mormonism?
As you might imagine, the scholarly study of Mormonism is rather delicate. The field of thinking about the Latter-day Saint Church and Latter-day Saint people is one around which there's a huge gulf. And on the one hand, you have people that we could call apologists, or let's just call them simply defenders of the faith.
Okay, okay.
And then we have people who are, can we just call them antis?
Yeah, sure.
And whose point is to challenge, to rework, to rethink. Now, those of us who are interested in more academic scholarship are interested in the ways that people are. And we lack that critical edge. I don't come at this with a viewpoint to challenge, to contradict, to, well, that sounds like BYU's academic freedom document. I don't come at it with any of those edges, let's say. My main purpose is to just understand how people are and what they are and what they do. But of course, to many Latter-day Saints and others, that is an elephant, as you said, because their question is he attacking us or is he defending us? And my point is neither. And of course, my background is Latter-day Saint, but I choose not to work from a position of faith. And my faith is my issue, my own personal concern.
Yes.
But for scholarship, I choose not to work from faith. Now, of course, Jordon can bring up some of the critical anthropology here, and you're welcome to. But that's a deliberate choice because I want to be clear for a Latter-day Saint community that I'm trying to come at this from an anthropological status, anthropological position. It reminds me, I could talk forever, but it reminds me of Mark Leone. He approached me at a conference some years ago, and I'd written about this community in Bolivia, and he said he thought I was one of the few people who could speak about Mormonism without bringing these edges into it. And so I hope that's true. I hope people feel comfortable with it.
I think so. And have you ever felt uncomfortable in the classroom or at a talk that David's been giving about people being offended or wondering where his point is going to go?
No, I mean, David's always been very civil in his discussions about very sensitive matters. But I think the most important thing is David has always taught us to think, I guess I would say critically about issues from all angles. But one of the things that this brings up is one of the sticky points of David's work is the problems of like a native anthropologist. Because one of anthropology's strengths is that it's supposed to be an outsider observing an outside culture. But David here is observing an inside culture, something to which he's been exposed to throughout most of his life. And I'm curious what he thinks those problems are. But I think he's been able to negotiate them quite successfully.
I think so too. And it kind of goes into the next area of your definition, the socioeconomic correlates of religious membership in Latin America, as well as the social organization and the transnational space of religion. So here in this region, we have a predominant faith, and I know there are other areas in the country and globally that have a predominance of faith, but this is unique. It's America's first religion, and you are an insider as an anthropologist. So how has your experience been?
Wow. Well, first of all, on the socioeconomic correlates, and let me postpone for a minute my experience.
Okay.
Let me warm up to that one.
Okay.
The socioeconomic correlates are really interesting. Utah is unique. And for me as an anthropologist, that is very attractive. There is no other part of the country where a faith has such a significant hold on the people. Utah, it's perhaps a little less now than 70%. But for much of the last decade, it's been between 70 and 80% of the population that's been Mormon. And one of the interesting things is that you see a diversity of Mormon population, but you also see that Mormons increasingly gravitate to the upper middle class. And there are complex reasons for that. But if you look at Salt Lake Valley, it's like a horseshoe. Mormons on the edges in the south, and then the center part is heavily non-Mormon. The center part also happens to be the poorest. It's the working class area. Now, this is not to say there aren't working class Mormons. There are. But we're talking in the abstract, the sort of complex aggregate. Now, oddly enough, when we look at Latin America, we see a similar pattern, although the missionaries work and convert heavily poorer people. They're probably the vast majority of the converts. Those people who claim to be Latter-day Saint to interviewers or to census takers tend to be fairly well off. And so we're seeing a similar pattern develop there, that Mormons are in almost every niche the slice above economically, above the Pentecostals and so on. In fact, even above Jehovah's Witnesses with a minor exception. So it shows something really interesting. And I think the jury has to be out still on what this means and why it's there. It's simply a pattern. But I find it very interesting. Now, as to my own personal experience as a native anthropologist, my gosh, that's a difficult task.
Yes.
Because, as you pointed, as we came up early, there is a lot of conflict here. And I don't know that everybody has always felt comfortable. It's not easy to have someone in the house with a magnifying glass looking at you.
No.
No matter the delicacy of the approach. And I think it's incumbent to try to develop a possibility, an opening. And I think that day has arrived. I think really we're seeing a fluorescence now of scholarship on Mormonism. Certainly, we've got a whole cohort of young anthropologists who are working, people of Latter-day Saint background, as well as people who are not Latter-day Saint, like Fenella Cannell from the London School of Economics, who spends her time hanging out on kitchen tables in Taylorsville and Sandy and Park City, interviewing people about their genealogy, and then writing about and presenting at major national and international meetings. So I think we've developed a new area.
Tell me about your experience with this, Jordon, and the type of scholarly activities that you plan to undertake, especially because of your influence from Dr. Knowlton.
Well, throughout the course of my time here at UVU, I've also been studying Mormons, first Native American Mormons, and then polygamous Mormon communities. And much to a much smaller extent than anything David's done. But it's been heavily influenced by David's work on Mormonism, in particular the emphasis on sentiment and discourse. I myself plan on going to Melanesia to study anthropology. But I will probably not continue to study Mormonism as much. But I think that Mormonism is a very exciting field within anthropology at the moment because of a lot of the issues that David and Fenella Cannell have brought out that point to some of the problems of definitions that we apply in anthropology about religion, about Christianity, about belief. A lot of these issues have been worked on for a long time and are just starting to be recognized.
Yes, well, you mentioned to me, David, in fact, we were talking about this before the program started, that a lot of people right now are looking at an article that you had written several years ago. It's having a rebirth, and that there are actually 2 dissertations being written from quite prominent areas on this topic. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this and how your scholarship takes on a life bigger than itself?
Well, actually, it's one of the fun things of publishing, or even now with these new media, getting out there and in print or in press or out on video. And that is that these have a life of their own. And sometimes many years down the road, people find pieces you've worked on or written, and they serve as catalysts for other people's thinking and work. Many years ago, when I came to teach at Brigham Young University in 1990, I was intrigued by, I was influenced by a couple of things. Feminism, the sort of, I guess, the development also of new masculine studies, new male studies, where people were taking the advances of feminist thought around gender and applying it to thinking of men as gendered instead of men just as human beings.
Oh, sure. My dissertation advisor spent a lot of time on that in my program as well.
Right. Well, it was very topical, as you know. And so I posed the question to myself here in Utah about what this literature had to say for the position of Latter-day Saint men as gendered beings. And I made a fairly complex argument that didn't sit well with some people, and I think other people found it quite intriguing. That was published in Sunstone magazine. And it had several articles respond to it. It's in the literature cited and blah, blah, blah. But what was really intriguing this last summer is that I was visited by 2 different graduate students from different universities, both of whom now are retaking this topic of masculinity and gender particularly as part of dissertation work. And so it was fascinating to talk with them and hear their read on an issue that frankly I haven't worked on for many, many years now. And we sat in cafes in Salt Lake over several hours and dialogued about the concern.
Well, it seemed to me also that this was in the context of the Mormon Church, which really teaches that spirituality is a strong emotion, and that it's that strong emotions can be expressed.
Sure.
And so, why would these 2 dissertations be focused on these strong spiritual emotions and being able to let others see how emotional
Well,
we
actually,
are?
the dissertations were less focused on that. That's been more contemporary journalism.
Oh, okay.
And Jordon, I know you had this point. Do you want to bring it up?
Well, the thing that is most interesting to me about the masculinity article on Mormon masculinity is how it relates to some of your other research, and particularly the practice of bearing testimonies. But one of the questions I also had about it was, those particular articles had to do with Mormonism here in the United States. But I was interested in what you felt were the correlates between those articles or those ideas expressed in those articles in your work in Bolivia.
Yeah, well, first of all, one of the things that amazes me about Mormonism is its ability to implant itself in other cultures and contexts. There's a real need for people to go out and study this global faith, to look at many local dynamics. But as I look at Bolivia, I'm amazed at the similarities. Now, you brought up the feeling, the sentiment. And I think what's really key here is the place of the emotions that is in our body becomes one of those primary places where we know God. So that it's in my heart, in the stillness of my being, where I'm expected to feel God's presence. And it's less auditory than it is feeling. And certainly missionaries, when they go out in the field, teach people to feel the Spirit as something that is a tingling. I mean, it's lovely to be in testimony meeting when the Spirit comes. People are bearing their testimonies, which can be really these complex things.
Yes.
Personal narratives, sometimes people are bored, and then suddenly the building will come just to still. And you can see almost the hairs rise on the back of people's necks, and the tingling go down their spine as they start looking galvanized and focused. And it's because of this feeling, the sentiment. And so what I'm really intrigued with is this part of experience that is deeply cultural and becomes a place that we open as for a cultural definition of where we can feel the divine. Now, in the masculinity argument, I'll get to what you were saying. The argument there was that because of this, Mormon men exist in a curious place vis-a-vis masculinity, and that they are expected often to show this emotion as a witness to their spirituality, their righteousness. And it happens to me too. It's odd for American men to cry.
Yes, it is.
Not for Mormon men on the pulpit, per se. Not that everybody does it, but it happens enough that you can see it as this public portrayal. We could call it performance, but that doesn't mean that people consciously do it.
Right.
In fact, I can't fake it.
Oh, no.
It happens. It's not fakeable. I'm sure there are people who can. I can't.
No.
And part of that is because it's anti-performative by definition, even though as an anthropologist we call it a performance. And in that is something we might want to talk about, is the ethics of these labels. But Jordon was posing the question as well as to how this works in testimony. We've talked about that. This sentiment then becomes a guarantee of what is reality and a guarantee of sincerity and authenticity. And so I think one thing that typifies this Latter-day Saint men, and to a different extent women, because women are structured somewhat differently, is the availability of our emotions almost right front and center as guarantees of social order, guarantees of practice, of inherent reality. And it makes it a strange place to counter, or for people who want to operate differently, it's a very strange place to protest, for example. If you want to, if you wanted to protest, like, let's say, the governor's current effort to raise taxes, how do you protest it when things are raised in an emotional place?
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
I absolutely do.
What I'm really interested though too is, I mean, like, is this something that translates to the culture in Bolivia, where Mormon men are expected to display those same emotions, and is that something that is also uncommon in Bolivian culture, like it is here in the United States?
Well, it's differently structured, of course, in Latin America in many areas. I mean, men can cry, and they can have their emotions, although their machismo is also very much there. You know, we Anglos look at Latin men and want to see them as these bullfighters, you know, the Hemingway-esque thing, and they are. But they're also not. They're the guys who are holding the babies and crying, you know. They're very dedicated to their families and children. They're very sentimental. You know, sentimentality is just all throughout Latin culture, whereas for us it's a bad word. So it's differently structured. I love this notion of structures of feeling, a structure of sentiment. It was developed by Raymond Williams, a British Marxist historian, but it goes deeply into continental philosophy, of course. The way that feeling is an important place. And of course, it goes into phenomenology, which is the issue, one of the issues you raised beforehand. We can come back to that if you wish. But I'm really interested in, I see in Bolivia the people who rise in the leadership ladder displaying very Latter-day Saint, American Latter-day Saint ways of deploying themselves and their emotions.
That's interesting.
Now, that does not play well necessarily outside. You feel them transformed. And sometimes they don't fit well in their own indigenous circumstances. Now, I don't know how that works. And as a scholar, it's something that I would hope some students sometime go and study, because I'm working on other topics. But it definitely needs to be looked at.
Well, I thought as far as phenomenology goes that maybe you could tell us a little bit about phenomenology in the context of a blog of yours that I read, where you were talking about that you found this small bag of stones and that you had purchased these from a young girl in Bolivia when you were writing your dissertation, and that they had become precious to you, they had meaning, and you'd saved them, and you thought about other artifacts that you had saved that gave spiritual meaning, your mother's scriptures. But the stones in particular seem to have several different meanings. Do you want to tell our audience what phenomenology is as a study and how that would tie into stones and artifacts?
Well, it's a very big word, and of course, like many big words of this, there are all kinds of academic schools and camps. So I'm going to keep it pretty simple. For me right now, phenomenology is looking at things in and of themselves, and posing the question of how do they move within a world? How do they operate? How are they perceived? And particularly when I'm dealing with humans, it's a very anthropological question of trying to get inside people's minds, their ways of thinking and being. And so it's posing the question of how does, like in a Mormon sense, how do Latter-day Saints live their religion? You know, now I could talk about that in terms of tithing, receipts. I could talk about it in terms of church attendance, you know, home teaching stats. Or I can ask, how do Latter-day Saints experience the Spirit? And I would argue the key to understanding Latter-day Saint life is the issue you raised, and that is this issue of the movement of the Spirit, and the feeling of the Spirit. And the way the Spirit is something that organizes people, builds community, but also builds the basic experience of life, and the cycling of the days, chronology, time. And so I see that just posing the question of how people feel and live the Spirit as a key to Latter-day Saint life. But phenomenology means that I have to take very seriously people's experience. Not necessarily their words. I have to look through their words to the experience.
To the experience. So you're not going to necessarily look at their meaning, the meaning they give it, you will.
I will, but the meaning is a way station to the experience.
Okay.
You know, this particular issue seems to be a strong contrast between some of the things that I know were a heavy influence on you from your graduate school. and your advisor, Greg Urban, who focused on a discourse-centered approach, a discourse-centered approach to culture. Do you want to explain more about the discourse-centered approach and its limitations and opportunities?
Well, we're getting really deep, and that's fine. Greg, who has gone on to be extremely prominent in anthropology. I mean, I worked with him when he was a brand new PhD, very young, right out of the University of Chicago. He's a student of Michael Silverstein, who's a brilliant linguist. Yeah. Okay. Greg was very interested in language. And one of his key things was noticing that language operated phenomenologically differently in the Xochitl people of South America than it does for us English speakers.
Is that right?
Yeah, part of this is a problem, what we could call reflexivity. It's the way language folds back on itself. So that we can think about language, we talk about language. And we use language as a primary place of being and experience. We do oaths, we view contracts, we play in language, we talk in language, we use it all the time. And you guys, I'm sure, are very aware of the arguments and difference of language between men and women, like Deborah Tannen's work. Okay?
Yes.
Well, Greg is one of these people, like Deborah Tannen, or like Joel Scherzer, or Richard Bauman, or just a whole range of people, who looked at language as a phenomenon. And so instead of the linguists who look at the structure of language, grammar, they look at speaking as something that is its own existence and reality. And they pose questions around its limits, the who, what, when, where, how, why. When does it exist? How does it exist? What does it do? And so they're looking at language as a phenomena. Okay? So the difference between me and Greg, in this case, because I love Greg's work, it's marvelous, is that I work with him, but in this particular case, I move past language. I'm interested in language, but language is not the whole of human experience. So I'm interested in other things, like in the case we're talking about, the structures of feeling. I'm interested in experience of being. Oh my gosh, that being word.
Yes.
But I'm very interested in those things.
Well, there seems to me one particular article of yours was very interesting to me in that it talks about the things that are unspoken or the unspeakable. Yes. So it's not just what is spoken, but it's what's not allowed or encouraged not to be spoken. Yeah. And that's a very important part of Mormonism and Mormon discourse. Do you want to explain that more?
Well, there are two parts to that for me, how I come at that. Well, three, I guess. One is silly French writers who just love the unspoken. It's learning to see the gaps, and I will credit French thought for that. But secondly, it's coming from people in the Andes and those stones, where I was taking these rocks. I bought them at the door of the temple of the Basilica of the Virgin of Copacabana.
Yes, yes.
From a young woman, and they're mostly blind women who sell them. They still do at certain feasts. And I say, what are these? Anthropologists, I want them to tell me what the meaning is.
Yes.
I want them to give me this whole narrative so I can write it in my notes and write an article about it, right? And what I get is, well, they're the platito de la Virgen, they're the virgin silver. And so I get a very limited narrative. I start asking questions about that, and I find gaps, blanks. I find I can't find meaning. And so where this led me to think was to notice that things like stones carry their own level of existence that aren't always mobilizable in language. And so, like in the Andes, if I want to be primarily engaged with someone, I might give them something. It's not the gift of language, it's the gift of something else that's tangible and concrete, like the stones. Okay. The second part of this was to realize that in my own native culture, the unspoken is very important, because that's also part of the space of the sacred. I'm encouraged to have spiritual experiences, but those are deeply private, not because they're not shareable, but because of the intimacy of a relationship with the divine. And there's sometimes the sacrality is maintained by the non-spokenness. And part of it is also then the movement to emotion as a primary way of communicating. So I let people know I have them because I get all tingly and my eyes water up.
Yes.
Okay? And everybody knows and they feel the same thing. And so we go in this commonality of feeling and sharing rather than me giving a narrative and saying, oh, so yeah, I was praying the other day and man, it was really cool. You know, I had this experience, and forgive me, but you know, I heard the voice of the Spirit, and I didn't. But you know what I mean? It would just sound cheesy.
It would.
Yeah. Whereas for my eyes to tear up, for me to get emotional, and the tingling, it communicates at a different level. And so I became very interested in the impossibility of language, the gaps of language, and of course that goes right to the temple ceremony.
Well, one of the things I thought was interesting about it was in my research with a Mormon fundamentalist group was that experiences would often be referred to but not expounded on. And it was the emptiness or the gap of that narrative that was far more powerful than ever expounding on it, because it not just held its sacred nature, but it also opened the realm of possibilities as to, you know, what they were referring to. It was unknown, and it was almost not a secret, but something that transfers power.
Sure, it's not the unknown, actually. I'm going to challenge your language a little bit. Let's stay with gap. Because it really is the phenomenological gap where something is not spoken. Because like the example on testimony, it's deeply felt. The speaking is not the important part, it's the feeling.
You know, in my own experience, I think you know that I was widowed, and my first husband was devout LDS and had profound spiritual experiences, and some days it would take him, sometimes it would take him several days, even a month or so, before he could even talk about it, because these are so deeply personal. Now, I'm recently married, and my husband is a devout Unitarian, which
very
means,
different.
very different, and, but he comes to the sacrament meetings and especially loves the fast and testimony meetings. And he also, as a non-member, experiences just what you say about these people who are portraying from the depths of their soul what their beliefs are and how grateful they are for blessings and other things. And for me, it's so important to see that it transcends membership. That is something that really does touch the heart. But the next question I have for you is also another part that I read on your blog, and it says we have a very rapid growth in membership in the church today, and it's a critical area for inquiry. All one has to do is listen to the general conference of the church to hear the confidence, the aplomb, the assurance with which the church presents itself to the world. So how is this different, you know, when you get up and you speak with confidence and aplomb, rather than what someone might say more is humility or letting the Spirit speak for you? Or
That's a really good point. I haven't thought about that. I'm going to talk and think at the same time, if I may.
Okay.
What I was writing about was the real difference between President Hinckley's administration and prior presidencies. Not at all critical.
No,
but
you're
as
never
president,
critical.
well, I thank God.
Yeah.
Literally. Well, there are different kinds of critique, and I think in some ways I am critical, but I don't want to be critical in the ordinary sense of the word.
Right.
President Hinckley assumed the reins of the church at a really key moment. You know, this was after the many years of almost emptiness in the first presidency because of President Benson's long illness. And the LDS Church is structured such that it really matters whether there is a strong prophet or not. Although the organization can keep going, it can maintain continuity. But he also came at a time where the church had grown substantially. It was right at the end of a massive period of growth, not just in Mormonism, but in all kinds of religion, especially Pentecostalism around the world. And the Brethren decided to put the brakes on that because they wanted to build leadership, build strong, solid wards and stakes. And we see following that a period of retrenchment where the roles are purged a bit of some of the weaker members. And not weaker members, but people who really aren't members other than just they were on the baptismal rolls. Now, as I listened to President Hinckley or other people speak, there was a feeling of newfound confidence. Now, that's an impression. What your question challenges me to do is to go back and look at the text and see how that actually is different in terms of words. I don't know that I can do that right now, and so let me just recognize that's a question. But I think it's more than the words. It's a sense of the way that feeling and power play themselves through language. So it's using language as something that moves to something else. This is opposite of anthropological study of language, but as you know, it's something in Christianity where language becomes one of those major places that allows you to know God. And so we're trained to look through it. In this case, I'm looking through language and arguing for a sense. But I think your question's good, and I think I really need to go back and demonstrate. And I don't know that I can right now.
Well, the issue of LDS membership and their roles of membership is something that you've published quite a bit on recently in this last several years. What do you think are the major issues around that, and what is it that is being utilized around those numbers? I know this is far more a social anthropologist question. But I think it's a very important one, and one that you've been exploring.
Sure. Well, numbers mean a lot. Can I pause on that? Because as I think about this, a contrast would be Elder Oak's recent talk at Idaho, BYU, Idaho. The LDS Church, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Seventh-day Adventists publish their membership numbers. Right. Numbers for them become a measure of legitimacy and a measure of the movement of God. Of their fulfillment of their religious mission. And each of those deals with numbers rather differently. Now, I as a social scientist am interested in numbers because we count things. I'm not a quantoid, that's not my style, but we count things nonetheless. And so one of our questions is, well, how many Mormons are there in the world? And so we'll go look at the church publications, and then we'll notice things like there's a rather low activity rate. So the question is, what do those numbers actually mean? And I think many people get confused because they worry about whether the numbers refer to real Mormons, whatever those are, and we forget to pose the question of what do those numbers mean to the church? And what I argued is that those numbers create a field of difference. And what's key there is they mark a change of phenomena, change of status of the person of reality, so that when you're baptized, that is to say, when you move from the category of non-Mormon to Mormon, you change your nature, and that's irrevocable from an inside perspective. Okay, Latter-day Saints have been challenged. Why don't you get rid of people off the rolls who don't go to church? And the brethren respond, because they may start going again. There may be another change of heart, but underlying that, I think, is this issue that they're changed in nature, and so they can't go into that other category. And we could see that in other ways. For example, let's say I were a student, I was raised LDS, I were to leave the church and then want to go to BYU, so I go convert again, get rebaptized. That's doesn't allow me to go back to the original category. Okay? That's unchangeable. And so the phenomenology here suggests that we really need to look and see what numbers mean. They're not simply pebbles we count or push the things on the abacus or the digits on our computers, our spreadsheets. But numbers carry meaning. And it's what they mean in terms of the nature of being that I think really matters. Now, I don't think many scholars have gotten that point yet, but to be honest with you, but I think it's very important.
I think it is too. Now, so is your question thoroughly answered, Jordon?
Well, I think so. Though I would say in many of your articles, you don't as much focus on the phenomenology, of LDS membership. It's more upon the structure of how it's counted and the realities of those numbers versus census records. But you got to that earlier when you talked about the issues of status and class in terms of reporting on those censuses, like on the Mexican census, for example.
Sure. Well, we could carry that even further. For example, what does it mean to be a good Latter-day Saint? How do you know someone's a good Latter-day Saint? And interestingly enough, I would argue that in many cases, not always, and not always is really important here, but in many cases that idea of a good Latter-day Saint carries coded class messages. So that it tends to be someone with the right kind of house, the right kind of car, the right kind of family, who dresses appropriate, the white shirt and tie, and well, not necessarily white shirt always, but the,
Right.
dresses in appropriate attire. It's the way you cut your hair, you coif your hair. It's the facial hair, non-presence of facial hair, actually, if you're male. So on and so on. Those are areas that carry class meaning. Now, if I were to come as an American working class person, today the men often have longer hair. They often have facial hair. They're often tattooed. I'm in Levi's today. What if I were to come to church in my Levi's and, they're clean? I guarantee you they're clean. I doubt I would ever be named bishop.
No.
And so it's the way that these things fit with other social dimensions like class that's interesting. Now, where I'm intrigued, as well as in the, let's say you have someone of working class background, yet who deploys the things of righteousness, the images of righteousness, their presentation of self is going to be fitting this other code, which in some ways runs counter to their class sense. Oddly, this is like the arguments around women, where it's been pointed out that at every class level, women tend to act higher on the class ladder, men act down. Men drop F-bombs, women speak more delicately, on the whole. On the whole. Not always.
Yeah. Well, what I also think is interesting about many of your points is that the numbers also offer legitimacy. So, a church organization who's attempting to proselyte within a country, those numbers can have very real material and political consequences. Do you feel like that's something that's being investigated enough?
No,
or?
Absolutely not. The dominant debate right now, as you know, in the sociology of religion is around secularity. And to put it very simply, the argument says that as countries develop, that religion declines. Religiosity declines. Now, that's the old argument. Along come people like Rodney Stark who say BS, that religion operates on other levels, and he argues that the major factor in religious growth or non-growth is actually a market, the way things present themselves in what he calls a religious market. The counters to him say, no, you're wrong, Rodney. Secularity still matters. And one of Rodney Stark's arguments is to notice a correlation between Mormonism and highly secular places. So he looks at different countries and shows that the LDS church tends to grow in situations of high secularity. Well, that needs to be nuanced and understood, okay? And I'm not going to go into the full argument right now by any means. There's a scholar whose name right now, I remember his first name, Ryan Cragen, in Florida, a young sociologist who's arguing that what that actually means is that Mormonism is secularizing very quickly. That we're seeing a loss of the religiosity. And his argument, to put it very simply, is to show how different we are from 19th century Mormons, where Latter-day Saint was an entire way of life. And now it's more encapsulated. Not that it's not important, but it's encapsulated. It's smaller. So we'll leave that argument out. But that's taking the oxygen that I think would be better spent on looking in detail at the phenomenology. Let me take another example. One of the real key things is the building of chapels. In the 70s and 80s, the church went through a massive building boom in Latin America. We built phenomenal. We built huge chapels, beautiful chapels, all over the place. We've now retracted a little bit. We've had to close some. We had some backlash. The chapels became targets for bombs. But why did we do that? Well, part was numbers. Numbers played a role as they fit through the church bureaucracy and became a trigger. Part is the decision of the Brethren for building a call to people and establishing a presence, a legitimacy, which it has done. Mormonism is nativized now. It's part of the landscape. Literally, it's built into the landscape of country after country. So I think we need to get more into the complexity of how those realities play themselves out and how numbers might fit into them instead of just worrying about secularization.
Yeah, another area in which you define yourself is the relationship between neoliberalism and social movements in Bolivia. So you're very much looking at it from a communitarian stance. You're going to look at these communities, how they come together, and maybe you could explain both of these senses to us: a neoliberalism stance as well as the communitarian stances.
Well, as an anthropologist, I have a background that runs counter to the dominant form of thinking in economics, which is more about individuals. I mean, Malinowski, who I mentioned earlier, was focused on individuals. But the dominant focused on groups of people. And I think sometimes we overemphasize groups. But that's a theoretical nicety. There's another sense of what you're asking, and we could pose how my theoretical frame fits in terms of the analysis of the realities, but that might be too weird in another way. So neoliberalism is simply the idea, we could call it free market economics. But it's a free market economics in a particular time and place. And this is free market economics that becomes dominant following the election of President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and becomes very strong in international organizations. And you get a transcendence, a celebration, and it becomes forced on many countries as almost a utopian vision, and particularly the Bolivia where I work. And along the way you have many people who are looking for justice, and they're posing other questions about their lives and worlds. Now, what's interesting here is that neoliberalism brings this individualist view from economics. It's about individual success, individual attainment. And so we want to solve poverty, we educate people. Okay? We forget that we still have to have people clean toilets, and you don't want PhDs cleaning toilets. But if everybody has a PhD, PhDs have to clean toilets.
Absolutely.
There's a collective, a systemic problem here that generally isn't addressed. So this individualism what I'm saying is it has gaps, it has blinders on it. The individualism became officially imposed. And as a result, people are responding against it. And they're tending to bring arguments like to ethnicity, to gender, to community, to other primordial situations, even nationalism, to argue against individualism, which takes the character of like a globalization, a force of globalization, or a force of neoliberalism, a force of political power, or just frankly Yankee imperialism. So in Bolivia, we saw that this became very much part of Aymara ethnicity and nationalism. We saw it's very much part of gendered movements right now in Latin America. And the ethnic nationalist political movement won and led to a break with the United States, so that Evo Morales, who just won re-election with 62% of the vote, sits at the pinnacle of this movement of social organization, social activism, but it's very deeply a counter to neoliberalism. Yet at the same time, Evo Morales is very sly in managing the economy, and Bolivia has a great surplus, is really in a very good financial shape, better than we are. But the U.S. is very powerful, and so it's at loggerheads. But we could look at these as discourses, we could look at them as economic issues, or we could look at them just as people moving their lives and trying to figure out how to exist on a given field.
You know, I just finished a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Oh, yeah.
Have you read that?
I haven't. I'm aware of the book. I'm familiar. I need to read it.
Yes, you do, because I think it would really tie into nations taking over their own economic identity rather than maybe what's forced on them by imperialists.
Well, one of the arguments today, and this is where I'm working, is about the nation state and its relevance. And we might be moving into a post-national situation where nations for most people of the world are not as relevant. And what's more relevant is ideas of global law, global organization. I mean, we see the resistance. For example, should the Supreme Court recognize international treaties? What status do our international treaties have in terms of our internal jurisprudence? Because if we recognize them, it's giving other groups a kind of hold over us. It's removing sovereignty. We're a big country. We can afford that question. It's very hard for a little country. And so we may be moving into a post-national phase. And the current nationalism may actually be a last gasp of the old style. But I don't know. I don't know. It's an interesting issue to see where we're going.
It is.
But the hitmen are really for international organizations against nations. And so it goes into this situation of what does it mean if you're Bolivia and trying to build a government where you're running up against very powerful organizations, whether it's an oil company that may make more money than you do. Bolivia has other things that make money, but it may make way more money than you do as a country and more powerful, and it has the connections with the United States. And it can literally bring a country to its knees. Evo Morales tried to nationalize their gas industry. In other words, it's really interesting. You know, George Bush could nationalize our banking system almost stroke of a pen. and far more than Evo Morales could nationalize his petroleum industry. What nationalism meant there, he just reversed the system of payments so that they have to pay more than they paid before of the earnings. And that means nationalization. Very different from the arguments around the banking system here in the United States.
Very different, yeah. Jordon.
Well, one of the things I think is interesting about this question of neoliberalism is some of the things that you've been researching most lately is around Ayong and Agamben, ideas of exception. Do you want to explain how that relates to neoliberalism and also religion as well?
Sure. Well, oh my. That's a big issue.
It must be.
Okay, I'm trying to think of how to do this quickly and easily. The concern here is around the limits of the neoliberal system. May I go to Habermas, okay, who I've been reading a lot recently. I've been in Germany, so he's easy to read.
I've always loved Habermas.
Well, he's fun. And Habermas brings a real interest in reason. And his argument is that the nation state, that modern bureaucracy, is primarily a system of reason. He's building on Weber, and his focus on rationalism and reason is very much the cutting edge of modernization. Habermas is interested in civil society as a place of reason, where people come together and reason in public. And he argues that religion has a very important role, but its role is less that of witnessing to the divine than it is of bringing morals and values to the public sphere. But it has to stand out of itself and engage in reason where reason becomes the space where we interact with one another. Now, there's an argument that points out that reason exists because you have a backstage where you push stuff off and say, we're not going to talk about this.
Yeah.
And that's an exception. And ultimately, the exception undercuts the reason. And so people like Ai Wa-Ang, although less her than others, are arguing, following Giorgio Agamben, the brilliant Italian political theorist, are pointing out that this exception is really important in the way that bureaucracies operate, and they're less rational than not. So let me go to my argument about religion. There are two parts here. First of all, religion's built as an exception, but it's a constrained exception. So that part of the history of the West is that religion is limited. Don't tell the Vatican. Now, what we mean is that the nation state is primary. You know, we can have the First Amendment because it is a First Amendment. It follows the organization of the government. And then we can go put in God we trust on the coins because God is nicely constrained and limited. Okay? But that exception, even though it's a constrained exception, becomes something of religion. And so we argue, what is the First Amendment? What fits there? And we often don't really go into that. Judges have to. But for most of it, we just take it for granted. Okay? My argument is that the boundaries between that exception and the other sphere of government are very important. And that to understand something like Mormonism, we need to understand those changing boundaries. So that we look at Mormonism in the 19th century as a very similar but very different animal. Now what I mean is it encompassed an entire society. You know, attempt to build a civilization, attempt to build Zion, attempt to build an economy, a society. And very quickly the U.S. came here. And we started a whole lot of struggle. And that struggle was an issue of boundaries, of what would be Latter-day Saint thought and reality. And I would argue that it's that struggle with the exception that it was being forced into that has made Mormon history. So I think there's a lot for us to think about. But it literally is posing a kind of Derridian question about what is this background, the conditions of speakability, the conditions of impossibility, if you will, of the order. It's the stuff that Habermas doesn't like to think about.
Yes, but it was a brilliant response, and I thank you very much. That was great. How about one last question, Jordon?
Well, one of the things that I came back to that question was that there's an interesting similarity between the exception of religion within the public sphere as well as the exception of neoliberalism within the public sphere and the ideologies of free market. Do you want to explain the similarities there? And
well, how do you develop it? You go ahead and explain it.
I know this is something that you've thought a lot about. And how does that work in Bolivia?
Well, in Bolivia, neoliberalism is very much a top-down kind of thing. It has broken many of the indigenous arguments, but it fits into a class structure of a kind of a set of elites that use neoliberalism or have used sounds like they're doing it phonily, and some are phony, others aren't. Others really, it's very organic, very deep. But it becomes a justification. It's a justification of reaching out into the external world and being part of a global system that provides their own economic base. On the other hand, you get people who are deeply nationalist and are very concerned about Bolivia as a whole and Bolivian society as an organic whole. And one of the key questions there is their national patrimony. So like around gas, Bolivia sits on one of the largest gas supplies in the New World. Okay, it may be the Saudi Arabia of coca production. It also is a Saudi Arabia of gas in Latin America. But people go, okay, we're a poor country. We have this wealth. What does it mean to develop it? The neoliberals will say, well, the best way to develop this is to sell it. We can put a pipeline and run the gas to Mexico, and then it can go to the United States. They'll buy it, we get the money, and so we do really well. The other people go, no, but that money goes to private individuals. It doesn't go for the collective good. How do we worry about build the collective good? And so the argument in Bolivia is around this collective good. What does it mean? Whereas the collective good is something that for neoliberalism, it argues that the more you give individuals the right to earn money, you raise the boat, that all ships rise as the tide rises. Whereas the other argument is saying, no. Those guys who get the tide rises, their ship gets up first, they're going to float and sail to another country and leave us naked and barren and poor. We want all of us to have it. And so how do we use these mineral resources, our water, our gas, our forests, and so on, our lithium these days? How do we use these to enhance everybody's good? And it's not just Bolivia, this is Brazil with Lula. And it's very much, or it's China, interesting enough, its kind of development. And yet from an American neoliberal perspective, we have this really hard time seeing that and giving it legitimacy. So there are all kinds of gaps here.
Oh, you know, sadly, we are out of time. But this was the perfect way to end this this discussion with you, David. And I can tell we're ready to go for another hour. The studio time's just kind of expensive, you know.
Oh yeah, no, thank you, Elaine. It's lovely to be here.
I'm so pleased that Utah Valley University stole you from Brigham Young University, and that you've come here to work with our students, that you're moving them forward in wonderful areas of scholarship that they never would have had the opportunity were you not here. And I hope that you continue to enjoy your time as our Ethics Center Senior Fellow this year.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the Ethic Fellowship, and I appreciate everything you do, and we've got great students.
We do. Thank you so much, Jordon, for being with us today.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.